Hello, and welcome once again to our introductory series on the divine principle. I'm Reverend Philip Shanker. In our first presentation, The Principle of Creation, we looked at the laws and principles that govern the operation of the physical universe, and from there could understand something about the nature and the purpose of its creator, the first cause, whom we call God. We also discussed the purpose and value of human life to realize the three blessings given to our first human ancestors: be fruitful or individually mature, multiply or create a God-centered family, and have dominion, loving dominion over the natural world. We talked about man's eternal purpose, that we live in two worlds, spiritual and physical, and that ultimately we have a portion of responsibility to cooperate with God in realizing His will and purpose in our lives. At the same time, we acknowledged that human beings have a contradiction, and that the world of our reality is vastly different than the world of our dreams. We're going to discuss today that contradiction as we look at the human fall. Let's begin. As we discuss this lecture series, you will see that along the bottom of the screen are the literal words taken directly from the divine principle, amplified by diagrams, and I will offer explanation and background for some of the major points. Anthropologist Richard Heinberg studied the creation myths and stories of the world's great civilizations. And Heinberg, in his book, The Memories and Visions of Paradise, noted, people in every culture and age have insisted that human nature is not natural at all because it's been distorted by some fundamental mistake or failure that's been perpetuated from generation to generation. Let's discuss the human fall. All people have an original mind which inclines them to pursue goodness, as we discussed in our introduction. Our conscience and original nature wants to be and to do good. And yet, even without our being aware of it, we are driven by evil forces to perform evil deeds which we do not want to do. We have a contradiction within ourselves, and every single one of us has experienced this struggle within, knowing we should do something, but not having the strength or willpower to act according to what our conscience tells us. Or conversely, knowing that we shouldn't engage in some behavior, yet when no one is looking, we can't resist the temptation or desire to act upon that. Now, in Christianity, the master of these evil forces is known as Satan. Until now, however, we haven't been able to overcome, and we've been unable to liquidate the forces of Satan because we've not understood Satan's identity or how he came to exist. This explanation of the human fall will address all of these concerns and clarify these issues. First, let's consider the root of sin. No one has clearly understood the root of sin, which lies deep within, driving us toward the way of evil, fueling that contradiction and conflict within ourselves. Now, on the basis of the biblical explanation, many have held to a rather vague belief that Adam and Eve's eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is, in fact, the root of sin. Let's consider the meaning of that fruit and the tree it grew upon, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the tree standing next to it, the tree of life. Many have thought that the fruit was that of an actual tree, but would God, a loving parent, place a dangerous fruit that could cause death to his children in their vicinity, in their innocence? Jesus said in Matthew 15:11, "Not that which goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth, because it proceeds from the heart." In other words, it's not what we eat that can defile us, but what comes from our heart, Please remember that point as we continue. Now, the result of eating that fruit is that original sin has been passed on from generation to generation throughout the history of mankind. But how is it that what someone would eat could impact later generations? It doesn't make sense. Now, many have concluded that simply the act of eating the fruit or the temptation set there was a test established by God. But would an all-knowing God need to test, a God who knew their hearts, would he need to test them to see what they would do? And would a loving God impose a test on innocent children and impose a punishment of death? In the day you eat of that fruit, you will surely die. That would be like a parent, myself or yourself, putting a tasty piece of chocolate cake in front of our children, saying, I've got to go to the store for some milk. You sit next to the cake, smell it, but don't eat it. And then sneaking away just to see if our children would disobey us. And if they disobeyed, the punishment would be, boom, death. It doesn't make sense. James 1:13 says, let no man say when he is tempted that I was tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted, and he himself tempts no one. James explained, temptation begins when we are lured and enticed by what? By our own desire. And desire, when it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. Now, that fruit, even as placed in front of them, was something they so ardently desired that they were willing to risk their lives to obtain it. What is it that a human being would desire so strongly that he would risk even death to obtain? We have to look more deeply. Remember, James said, desire gives birth to sin. Sin brings forth death. The fruit caused them to violate God's commandment, and they died. In order to understand the meaning of this fruit, we have to look deeper. Now, why should we stubbornly adhere to a literal interpretation of the fruit when so much of the Bible makes use of symbolism and metaphor? Look at the most important truths of the Bible. They're conveyed symbolically. For example, the words of Jesus. Now, in Mark 4:24, it says that Jesus never spoke to the public without using a parable. That's Mark 4:34. He never spoke without using a parable. Why? You and I would say the parables were to illustrate and convey the meaning of his teaching. But in Matthew 13, his disciples asked him, and Jesus said, I speak in parables so that some hearing will not understand. Now why? Why would Jesus desire that some people would not understand his message? Why would he speak in code or indirectly? Well, the answer is not difficult to understand. In Matthew 7, Jesus said, don't give pearls to swine or holy things to dogs, for they'll trample them underfoot and turn around and bite you. In other words, precious and profound truths should not be given to those who don't have the foundation to receive them or who merely want to use them against you. And so Jesus spoke in a kind of code through symbols so that those who had the foundation to understand could catch his meaning, while everyone else thought he was talking about fruits and farmers and seeds and sowers. The book of Revelation, which talks about the end of the world, how history will end, is filled with symbols. 7-headed beasts with 10 horns on their head coming out of the sea. Angels coming out from the rising of the sun. Cities descending. Blood flowing. All kinds. Horsemen riding. All of these are not literal but symbolic and have a deeper meaning. So, the cause of evil, the root of sin, isn't it one of the most important teachings in the Bible? If we consider it literally, what can that story teach us other than don't take fruit from strangers or never trust a talking snake? But looking deeper at its symbolic meaning, we can understand some profound truths. To learn what the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil represents, let us first investigate the tree of life, which stood next to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. See, the tree of knowledge of good and evil is mentioned only once, only in that story in Genesis. But its companion, the only two trees named and symbolized, the tree of life, is mentioned all throughout the Bible. In what capacity? In the Old Testament, it is set up as the goal and the ideal of people of faith. Proverbs 13:12. Hope deferred makes the heart sick, but desire fulfilled is a tree of life. In the New Testament, Christians are pointed toward the attainment of the tree of life. Revelation 22:14. Blessed are those who wash their robes, for they shall have the right to the tree of life and can enter the city by its gates. Now, washing one's robes, again, is not literal. It's not doing our laundry. It represents cleansing and purifying. And in Revelation 3, Jesus promises that the victorious believer will regain access to the tree of life. So what is this tree that fallen people have longed for and sought after all throughout history? Well, we can recognize that since the ultimate hope of humankind is the tree of life, we can infer that Adam's hope was also the tree of life. In fact, Genesis 3:24 says that the access that Adam had to the tree of life prior to the fall was blocked, was lost to him. He lost access by the fall. An angel with a flaming sword, a cherubim, was guarding the way to the tree of life. Now, as we'll learn in later discussions, the sword, like the sword that comes from the mouth of the Lord, and flames, like the fire that Jesus came to cast on the earth, are symbolic of the truth. So what is this tree of life that Adam had access to, lost by falling, has been sought after by men and women of faith throughout history, is attained by victorious believers, and then also ultimately we must go through the truth in order to reach it? We consider what was the hope of Adam during the time he was immature and growing toward perfection. Was it money, power, or earthly gain? It wouldn't have been that, because he had all things set before him. Adam's longing, he must have hoped to become a man who would realize God's ideal of creation by growing to perfection without falling. Adam's desire was to fulfill his purpose in life, his future, his goal, his career, his life and experience in the world. That's what he was aimed at, and that's what the tree of life represents. Let's consider that the symbol used for the first blessing to Adam and Eve is that of a tree. Be fruitful, like a tree grows to fully mature with the bearing of fruit. Likewise, the tree of life is continually used as that kind of symbol throughout the Psalms. In the first Psalm, blessed is the man who walks in the ways of God. He is like a fruit-bearing tree, and he will bear much fruit. Also, Jeremiah 17 says, a righteous man who believes in the Lord has a deep root and will bear fruit, but a wicked man has no root and will not bear fruit. Likewise, in the New Testament, Jesus said, I am the vine, and you are the branches. If you abide in me, he who abides in me, he it is who will bear much fruit. Therefore, we can understand that the tree of life, in fact, symbolizes a man who has fully realized the ideal of creation. Perfected Adam was to be that ideal man. It thus symbolizes perfect Adam, a man of life, a fruitful tree, a fruitful man, a tree of life, a man of life. Now, let's consider the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and its significance. God did not create Adam to be alone. He also created Eve to be Adam's spouse. Just as there was a tree in the Garden of Eden which symbolized a perfected man, there also should have been a tree which represented a woman. This is the significance of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The only two trees mentioned in the Bible and given a symbolic name of life or knowledge are these two trees standing in the center. This represents the ideal of human beings to become true and perfected people. Excuse me. These two trees standing in the center are clearly symbolic. You will never find them in a botanical garden. You will never see them discussed in a book on horticulture. They are symbolic and represent the ideal and goal of the first human ancestors. Now, let's consider the identity of the serpent, another significant element in this story. In the Bible we read that a serpent tempted Eve to commit sin. What does the serpent symbolize? The serpent described in the Bible was able to converse with people, able to communicate with human beings. This is not something normally that an animal literally can do. Furthermore, the serpent knew the will of God, which strictly forbade human beings to eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He said, did God say that you should not eat of this fruit, etc.? Oh, he was just trying to prevent you from becoming like him. So he knew God's will. This kind of a spiritual being, it's compelling evidence that this being was, the serpent symbolizes a spiritual being with the capacity to communicate, to know the will of God, etc. Now, Revelation 12:9 describes something more about this serpent. That great dragon, Revelation says, was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. It goes on, he was thrown down to the ground, and his angels were thrown down with him. So we have a being who's able to converse with human beings, who knows God's will, who has the wisdom and deceitfulness to tempt Adam and Eve, whose home was originally in heaven, had dominion over angels, and was cast down to the ground. We are left with the conclusion that the spiritual being represented by the serpent was not an animal, in fact, literally, but a symbol for Satan. What kind of spiritual being, even after it had fallen and become degraded to an evil being, could transcend time and space to dominate the human soul? There are no beings endowed with such characteristics other than angels. So this serpent who tempted human beings and sinned is an angelic being. Now please note, in 2 Peter 2:4, the Bible says that God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into pits of nether gloom. Please remember that. Angels who sinned, cast into pits of nether gloom. The Bible also identifies a particular angelic being in Isaiah 14:12 as one who was originally in heaven, had dominion over angels, who tried to make himself like the Most High and fell down, was cast down. How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who made the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, above the stars of God. But you were brought down to hell, to the depths of the pit. Our conclusion is that the serpent who tempted Eve was an archangelic being, originally in the position closest to God, but was cast down as a result of his evil action and became Satan. Now let's consider the sin that caused the fall of the angel and compare it with the sin that caused the fall of Adam and Eve. First of all, the angelic sin. Jude chapter 1, verses 6 and 7 refers directly to the angels who sinned and were cast into pits of nether gloom. And it compares their sinful act to the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah. Please read with me. From Jude 1, 6 to 7, we can infer that the angel fell as a result of an illicit sexual relationship. And the angels that did not keep their own position, but left their proper dwelling, have been kept by him in eternal chains in the nether gloom until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise acted immorally and indulged in unnatural lust, serve as an example, etc., etc. Now, the Bible clearly means that Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities likewise acted as did the angels, indicating that the angelic sin was the sin of the misuse of God's precious ideal of love through an illicit sexual act or experience. Now let's consider the sin of Adam and Eve. From Genesis 3:7, we read that prior to the fall, Adam and Eve were both naked, but they were not ashamed. Was there any reason for them to be ashamed? Was there something wrong with their nose? Was there something wrong with their chin or belly button or knees? Nothing faulty and so no shame. However, after the fall, they did become ashamed. Let's look. After the fall, they felt ashamed of their nakedness and sewed fig leaves together into aprons to cover their lower parts. Now that's unusual. They didn't cover their mouths, which had eaten something, or their hands, which had stolen something. They felt compelled to cover their sexual areas. Now, just understanding human nature makes it clear to us where their guilt and shame was focused. As you can see, I'm a person that enjoys eating. And when I was young, my mother was very good at catching me in the cookie jar. I'd be going into the jar, my mother would walk in, or I'd have a mouthful of cookie. And when she did that, I might have put the cookie behind my back, covered my mouth. What are you doing? Mm-hmm. Have you been eating those cookies? Mm-mm. Are you telling me the truth? Mm-hmm. But there was never a time when my mother caught me eating something wrong when I did this. It doesn't make sense. Our understanding of human nature tells us their shame and their guilt was focused on their lower parts. Adam and Eve's sexual parts were the source of their shame because they were the instruments of their sinful deeds. Job 31:33, Job says, like Adam did, I too have covered my sin by hiding mine iniquity, concealed my transgression, he said, by hiding mine iniquity. What is it that Adam covered? Hence we can deduce that if the angelic sin was an illicit sexual relationship and the human sin was an illicit sexual relationship, that something must have occurred between the angel and human beings. Now remember, the serpent, representing the angel, tempted Eve to partake of the fruit, which represented what? It represented Eve's maturity or love on a tree that should have become ripe, but she was not yet given permission. The time was not yet ripe. The angel tempted Eve to partake of that fruit prematurely. Then Eve, in turn, tempted Adam to partake of that fruit. An illicit sexual relationship. Let's look more deeply now at the meaning of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What does the fruit represent? The fruit signifies the love of Eve. In the same way, as a tree grows to maturity, bears fruit, which in maturity contains healthy, ripened seeds, which become the basis of reproducing. So also, a human being in maturity is meant to multiply and reproduce through God-centered love and sexual relationship. So Eve's eating of the fruit denotes that she consummated a false or satanic love relationship with the angel, which bound her in a spiritual or even a blood connection to him, blood ties. That's the significance. Now Eve should have borne good children in maturity through her godly love. Instead, immature and self-centered love, through that she bore evil children through false love. So we can conclude then that the root of sin was not that the first human ancestors ate a literal fruit, but rather that they had a false, premature, self-centered relationship, misused love with an angel, symbolized by a serpent. Now there is a preponderance of evidence of this particular fact, that this is in fact the case. It's interesting to note that the tree they ate of was the tree of knowledge. And in the Bible, knowledge is not always meaning learning or understanding. When the Bible says that Adam knew Eve and she bore a child, Lot knew his wife and she bore a son, Cain knew his wife, the knowledge indicates intimate relationship, which in this case, mature and complete, is good. Premature and self-centered, evil. Also, they ate of a fruit, which is a common metaphor in today's Middle East and at the time of the Bible for an intimate relationship with the opposite sex, to eat or pick a fruit. But you can say, well, where's that in the Bible? Please study the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, which describes the relationship between newlywed lovers and uses eating the choicest fruits of my beloved, climbing her tree and picking the fruits that represent her body and her love, etc. So we can understand even biblically these are common metaphors used in this way. Also, we now can understand the significance of original sin, because eating a fruit wouldn't impact my descendants. But how is something passed from generation to generation? Through sexual relationship, sexual love. Also, we can consider that if we look at the Old Testament, the Jews were called by God to become his people. And he made a covenant with them that they should atone for their sin with equal payment, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, etc. And the sign of the covenant, the signature, was that every Jewish male child should be circumcised, cutting the foreskin, draining the blood. It was a spiritual rite in order to reconcile them to the position of God's children. Look in the New Testament, and we find that both Jesus and St. Paul advocated celibacy. Jesus said there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of God. And Paul said, it is good to be married, better than to burn in sin. But he who refrains from marriage does even better. Now, when God created man, he said, it is not fitting for man to be alone. And I will make him a helpmate fit for him. He said, be fruitful and multiply. So how is it that God's original intention for man and woman to be together can become something that both Jesus and Paul recommend you avoid if you want to serve God? The only possibility is that somehow that ideal of love had become defiled, corrupted, and misdirected. Sexual immorality has caused the downfall of kings, presidents, heroes, religious leaders, and the decline of civilization. When we look at the preponderance of sexual immorality, it's the one thing that even the advance of civilization cannot end, because it's a corruption that arises from the heart. Let's look then more deeply at the course and motivation. We'll consider section 2, the motivation and the process of the fall. First, in order to understand how this problem arose, we need to understand the mission of angels and their relationship to the universe, to God, and to human beings. Angels were created by God prior to any other creation. God created them to be his servants, as an angel calls himself a servant in Revelation, and ministering spirits, as they're called in Hebrews, who would assist God in creating and sustaining the universe. God himself is beyond time and space. In order to develop and prepare the creation as an environment for his children, God needed a substantial object, conscious, spiritually aware, that could relate with him, through whom he could work and develop in the creation. This is the mission of angels. That's why throughout the Bible, angels are agents of God, acting on his behalf, and also responding to him, praising him, and glorifying God. But in Hebrews, Paul says that they also are ministering spirits to attend who? The heirs of salvation. That's us, to serve man. And so all throughout the Bible, we see angels bringing messages to human beings, to the central figures of God's providence. We see an angel unlocking Peter from prison. Because God created human beings as his children and gave us dominion over all creation, we are meant to rule over the angels as well. That's why Paul wrote in Corinthians, do you not know that we are to judge the angels? So, as children of God, we are meant to rule over all of the creation, all of the environment. That includes both physical and spiritual worlds. Jesus said, the servant does not remain in the house forever, but the son remains forever. Meaning that a servant is in the household based on the good works that he does. But a son, as an heir, has an inheritance and a right that's even deeper and higher. This is the relationship between human beings and angelic beings. From there, we can now consider the spiritual fall and the physical fall. God created human beings with two components, the spirit self and the physical self. Likewise, we live then in two dimensions of reality. And the human fall likewise took place in these two dimensions, the spiritual dimension and the physical dimension. The relationship that took place between Eve and the archangel, the fall that took place through the sexual relationship between the angel and Eve, was the spiritual fall, while the fall that occurred through the relationship between Eve and Adam was the physical dimension of the fall. Let's look at each of these two one by one. First of all, the spiritual fall. After the creation of human beings, Lucifer, feeling as though he were receiving less love than he deserved, wanted to grasp the same central position in human society as he enjoyed in the angelic world as the channel of God's love. This was why he seduced Eve, and this was the motivation of the spiritual fall. Let's consider Lucifer's motivation. Now, prior to the existence of human beings, as an archangel, Lucifer was closest to the love of God, and it was through him that God's love was channeled to the whole of the angelic world. He was closest until when? Until the creation of Adam and Eve. At that point, God did not love Lucifer less, but human beings with a deeper capacity of love, with ownership over creation, with self-awareness and a deeper sense of moral capacity, could experience a dimension of love from God and relationship with the universe that the angel couldn't touch. So Lucifer sensed, comparatively, a lessening of love. Not because God was loving him less, but because God's children were now present. It's similar to the feeling of an older sibling who sees a brand new, younger baby brother or sister brought home. Parents aren't loving their older child less, but at that time, the baby needs more attention. And so the elder can feel comparatively less love. Now, this is the motivation that led the angel to seek to access that love by coming closer to Adam and Eve, and naturally being attracted to Eve, who was beautiful in the love of God. But when Lucifer's motivation, when his desire for love became so strong that he determined to dominate that love, even if it meant destroying God's plan or undermining Adam and Eve's purpose, from that moment he became an enemy. In other words, when his love changed from a God-centered love for the sake of others to a self-centered love, he became an enemy. The Hebrew word for enemy is Satan. Lucifer became an enemy when he became the first being in creation who said, "Me first." Now let's consider the motivation of Eve. Lucifer, who left his proper position due to his excessive desire, and Eve, who wanted to open her eyes and become like God before the time ripe, formed a common base. The power of the unprincipled love generated by their give and take led them to consummate an illicit sexual relationship on the spiritual plane, on a spiritual level. Now consider first Eve's motivation, and then we'll consider the possibility of such a relationship. As long as Eve related to God, her father, she was learning the heart of a true daughter. With her brother Adam, she learned the heart of a sister. Eventually, she would learn the heart of a wife and mother, experiencing these dimensions of womanhood in a pure and natural setting. But suddenly, a self-centered love was focused upon her, and in her immaturity, she couldn't sense or compare God's love, which she had a limited capacity to understand, with the attention being poured on her by the angelic being in her presence. As Eve began to have give and take with this love, she became emotionally drawn, emotionally connected, ultimately confused and unclear. And so the power of that unprincipled love overcame her understanding of the commandment and of God's will. And she engaged in an illicit and false sexual relationship. Now, we also might ask, how could such a relationship be possible between an angelic being and a human being? In fact, the Bible describes concrete contact between angels and human beings several times. For example, an angel wrestles with Jacob, strikes the hollow of his thigh and knocks it out of joint. Similarly, angels come to Lot Angels come to Abraham, eat food, take meals, and at times are unrecognized. In fact, Hebrews 13:1, Paul says, "Be careful to entertain strangers, for in this way some have, without knowing, been entertaining angels." So their appearance and relationship and connection with human beings in a substantial way is biblically supported and apparently possible. So now let's consider the physical fall. The second aspect. Eve then seduced Adam with the hope that by uniting with him, she could rid herself of the dread and once again stand before God. In the heat of passion, in the power of her emotion, Eve became confused. She justified her action and got lost in the emotions. But when passion cooled, Eve felt empty. She'd been used, not loved. She understood that she was not meant to relate with the angel, and she was desperate to regain her lost innocence. She should have turned to God, but that was too painful. She instead turned to Adam. She was filled also with fear, guilt, and shame. These were the feelings that arose first in the angel when he knowingly and willingly contradicted God's will. Any human being will have the same experience when we act against what we know is right. Fear, guilt, and shame will arise. Eve inherited these feelings and sensibilities through her relationship, intimate relationship with the angel when they exchanged spiritual elements through their sexual give and take. Now she desired to rid herself of that dread. This was Eve's motivation, which led to the physical fall. As she came to Adam and sought to regain that relationship, tragically, she'd learned through her false relationship with the angel a false femininity. And now, Adam was drawn and ultimately seduced by that desire. Adam responded, formed a common base with Eve, who was now standing in the position of the archangel. They began give and take action with each other, which brought them together in an illicit physical relationship of sexual love. Not that sex itself is a problem. It's intended by God. It's the holiest and most beautiful of acts that bring a man and woman into oneness centered on God. But here, self-centered and premature, it was a misuse of God's ideal of love. Let's now consider the power of love, the power of the principle, and God's commandment, section 3. First of all, the power of love and the power of the principle. For human beings, the force inherent in the principle guides their growth in the proper direction. It's the natural force of natural law that guides our physical bodies and all of the universe into maturity. Likewise, in our spiritual selves, we have moral sensibility. And based on the principle, we are meant to grow toward goodness. Only if some stronger force with an unprincipled purpose collides with this direction of the principle can they possibly fall. In that case, they would surely fall, like a train on a track. They were growing according to the laws of their own original nature. And only it would require some strong force to knock that train off the track. The force which is stronger than the force of the principle is none other than the power of love. Let's consider why it is that the power of love was created by God stronger than the power and force of the principle. First of all, it's because God himself is love, as the Bible says. The essence of God's nature is his heart, and everything else in God, his righteousness, his justice, his lawfulness, his order, everything else in God is what it is and does what it does solely because of his nature of love. So love is the deepest aspect of God. And God wanted to rule human beings, not by power, not by force, not by fear of commandments and fear of punishment, but by love, to be bound in love. And therefore, love was created to be the strongest force. God did not want a world where human beings would be automatons or robots and God is pulling the strings. That would be a world where we're ruled by principle, where our attention to laws is stronger than the passion, desire of our heart. God didn't want such a world. In fact, if the world were a world based on principle and law, where would be the passion, the poetry, the longing when we're far away from those we love, the joy of coming together when we see them after a time of being apart? These would not exist, but the world was meant to be made based upon heart and love. In order for love to fulfill this role, it had to be created stronger than the power of the principle. But now, as human beings are growing in the process of development, while they're in the state of immaturity, it would then be possible for the power of an unprincipled love to induce them to fall. In order, therefore, to protect them, let's consider why God set up the commandment as an object of faith. To prevent the power of unprincipled love, God gave Adam and Eve the commandment, thus forming a common base with God and engaging in give-and-take action with Him. In other words, He gave them His word as a condition. By relating with God's word and simply obeying, they could overcome every difficulty or challenge. It's much the same as you would relate to an immature child. You can't expect them to be morally responsible in every case. You can't expect them to understand the consequences or to be devoted, reliable, and responsible. So you simply tell them what you want them to do and give them consequences if they disobey. This was how God gave them a condition to overcome the power of love. To prevent this power, Adam and Eve were given the commandment, giving them a common base with God so they could relate. Tragically, Adam and Eve did not obey this commandment, but formed a common base with the angel and had give and take with that power. Human beings, therefore, need, in the process of restoration, if we're going to return to our original capacity, we need, therefore, to relate with God's word, be faithful to it. This portion of human responsibility, which failed, brought the fall, is the element that needs to be restored in the process of restoration. Let's consider the consequences of the human fall. Section 4. First of all, Satan and fallen humanity. Satan is the name given to the archangel Lucifer after he fell, enemy or adversary. When the first human ancestors fell, they bound themselves in a spiritual and physical bond, blood ties, with Lucifer. In other words, their give and take relationship, instead of being centered on God in maturity and producing loving children and a good tradition and a good world, became a false and self-centered love, centered on a false master and multiplied evil. They formed a four-position foundation, yoked, bound to Satan, and thus all humanity became the children of Satan. For this reason, Jesus said in John 8:44, "You are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires," calling Satan our father. Likewise, in Matthew 12:23, Jesus angrily called the people a brood of vipers, or offspring of serpents. It's also for this reason that Romans 8:23 states that we need to be adopted in order to become God's children. Now, if God to be our Father needs to adopt us, it means that someone else has become in the parental position. And it's for this reason that Christianity teaches that in order to enter the kingdom of heaven, we have to be born anew, born once again. Nicodemus asked, he asked to Jesus, does that mean I have to go back into the womb of my father and mother and come out one more time? But no, rebirth is through heavenly parents, parents of a new lineage, and that's the role of Jesus and the Holy Spirit. It's the reason why Jesus said in the 6th chapter of John, "You must eat my flesh and drink my blood." It doesn't mean vampirism. It means that we must become and inherit the flesh and blood of Jesus. Be my flesh and blood. Connect to my lineage. Connect to my heritage, which once again, is directly from God. Secondly, Adam and Eve fell while they were still immature. And so as Satan gained dominion over man, he also, through man, gained dominion over all of the creation. The whole world has come under Satan's sovereignty. Therefore, in John 12:31, Jesus called Satan the ruler of this world. In 2 Corinthians 4:4, St. Paul called Satan the god of this world. Now let's consider Satan's activities in human society. Satan cannot perpetrate his evil activity unless he first finds an object partner with whom he can form a common base and engage in give and take. In other words, Satan is not omnipresent like God. The only way self-centered, dominating, self-justifying evil can be multiplied is if there can be a common base, if he can draw other beings into that relationship. Now, Satan's object partners are evil spirits in the spirit world, first of all. Then, the objects of these evil spirits are the spirit selves of people on earth. Therefore, we can be influenced not only by good desires, but also false and self-centered and obsessive desires that seem to come from beyond us. The vehicles through which these evil spirit selves act are our own physical selves. And this, therefore, becomes the process by which evil action is strengthened, initiated, empowered, and multiplied into the world. Accordingly, the power of Satan is conveyed through evil spirits and is manifested in the activities of earthly people. Next, we'll consider the meaning of sin. Now, until now, we've had some understanding that sin means separation from God or missing the mark. But let's be a little bit more clear. Sin is a violation of heavenly law, committed when a person forms a common base with Satan, thus setting a condition for give and take action with him. In other words, when a person thinks or acts outside of God's principle, outside of God's law, it automatically creates a basis for a relationship with the Lord of that unprincipled realm, or Satan. Now, as a result of that common base, give and take action will begin, pulling us in the wrong direction, causing us to struggle with that contradiction and act against our conscience, leading to a violation of heavenly law. This is the process by which evil power tries to dominate and compete to justify its existence and maintenance of position, of the false position claimed through the fall. Now, sin can be classified into 4 different kinds. Now, here we're not talking about degrees of sinfulness, how bad, but we're talking about the different ways in which the false god, Satan, has laid a claim on humankind. The first classification of sin is original sin. This sin originated with our first human ancestors and is ingrained in our lineage. In other words, Satan's first basis to claim, to relate with human beings, is the fact that our first ancestors engaged in a false love relationship, inheriting his self-centered love. That is the deepest and most endemic aspect of the sinful nature of man, the desire for self-centered love. It's like the root, and all other sinful actions arise out of it. The second sin is hereditary sin, this classification. This is the sin that one inherits from one's ancestors, as in Exodus 20, verse 5, where it says that the sins of the fathers are visited upon later generations. It's the same as a debt left unpaid will be inherited. So also, Satan seeks to justify his involvement and claim with human beings based not only on the original condition of false love, which we've inherited, but also those sins we inherit from our ancestors. The third classification is collective sin, the sin for which a person is responsible by virtue of being a member of a group. I am the son of Scottish and Russian ancestors who owned no slaves and committed no acts of persecution against the black race. And yet, as a white man, born and raised in America, based upon a history of hundreds of years where the white race committed inhuman acts of separating husbands and wives, parents and children, and burdening the life of millions and millions of those who were brought from Africa. I stand in a position of being collectively responsible as a white person to be accused for the sins collectively of my ancestors. But the black race, every group, similarly has such areas of collective responsibility for which we are accused. Finally, the fourth classification is individual sin, which an individual commits in our own lifetime. Based upon these conditions, the power of evil seeks to establish a connection, to draw us in another direction, to divide us and cause us to struggle. Now, original sin should be thought of as the root. And that nature of self-centered love, as I said, is the deepest and most endemic aspect of our human desire for evil. But out of that desire has arisen all of the other sins, the sins of our ancestors, the sins collectively, which are like the trunk, the sins collectively of different groups, which are like the branches, and our personal acts of unrighteousness, which are like the fruits and the leaves and the flowers. Let's now discuss the primary characteristics of the fallen nature. Eve inherited from the archangel all of the tendencies incidental to his transgression against God when he bound her in blood ties through their sexual relationship. As the angel turned his nature toward himself, away from God, all kinds of tendencies developed to justify his position, to be jealous and envious, to compete, to try to draw others. All of these natures which did not come from God have been inherited by us. And together, they form the basis of our fallen nature, our fallen traits. Adam, in turn, acquired the same inclinations from Eve, and these proclivities or tendencies have become the root cause of the fallen inclinations of all people. We call them the primary characteristics of our fallen nature. These characteristics of the fallen nature can also be divided broadly into four types. The first is the failure to take God's standpoint. If the angel had been able to rejoice in the birth of God's children, to share God's happiness, to see Adam and Eve as God saw them, he could have overcome his feeling and experienced God's love through Adam and Eve. Instead, he looked at them from his own viewpoint, saw Adam as a rival, began to compete, and tried to draw love to himself. This tendency, inherited by human beings, is the basis of selfishness, self-justification, to rationalize and explain reality to justify the actions we take. It's also the basis of jealousy and envy and these kinds of and resentment in these kinds of areas. The second of the four fallen natures is leaving one's proper position. The angel, unable to keep his proper position, instead left it because he felt less love in that position. The Bible speaks of angels who were not content to keep their proper home. This tendency gives rise to the nature in human beings of irresponsibility, to break our commitments, to be unfaithful to spouses, to be disloyal, to betray those who trust us. It's also our tendency to be deceitful. The easiest thing for a human being to do, unfortunately, is often to lie in order to avoid responsibility for the actions that we've taken. The third fallen nature, reversing dominion. Not only did the angel leave his proper position, but he reversed, trying to put himself above Adam and Eve, seeking to enjoy the same central position in the human world that he'd enjoyed in the spiritual world. The Bible says that Lucifer sought to put himself above the stars of God. Stars means children. To make himself like the Most High. This is the third fallen nature. It gives rise in human nature to arrogance, when we put ourselves above others, actually because we feel insecure and lack a sense of value. Judging, dominating. All forms of racism, and sexism, and prejudice arise from this reversing of dominion. The fourth and final fallen nature, multiplying the criminal act. The angel drew Eve into his false self-centered love. Eve drew Adam into the same, and as parents they multiplied this evil to their children. Always evil seeks to multiply, and we all know that bad news travels fast. That it's easier to multiply negativity than it is goodness. Rumors, gossip, complaint, and seducing and tempting and causing others to sin are examples of this fallen nature. Finally, our final section will reflect on the reason God did not intervene in the fall of the first human ancestors. God, being omniscient and omnipotent, must have known about the deviant acts of the human ancestors. He saw what was going on amongst our first human ancestors. Then the question is, why then did God not intervene to prevent the fall? Was God able to intervene? Of course, God can do whatever he wants. He's God. But why is it that the God of principle, of order, and of law did not intervene? There are three reasons. The first is to maintain the absoluteness and the perfection of the principle. If God, perfect and absolute, were to contradict his own laws of nature and creation, were to violate his own principle and reach into the realm where human beings are still growing, unable to identify and relate with God directly, in order to correct or protect them, he would be undermining the very value of the principle and its absoluteness. Secondly, it was so that God alone would be the creator. If God were to acknowledge the self-centered love and relate with it, the love that was developing centered on the archangel, God would be acknowledging what he had created. He would have been including in his own realm of authority the elements that are outside the principle, outside the law. And so in order to maintain the sole position of creator and not to empower the role of the false god, Satan, he did not intervene in the fall. The third reason is to make human beings the lords of creation. If God had intervened prior to our maturity in order to protect us, he would have undermined our own authority, our own creative responsibility, making us not self-realized co-creators, but those who were controlled and manipulated. While it would have prevented the tragedy of the fall, it would have undermined the very value for which he created human beings, to be free, creative, responsible, loving children. For these reasons, God was not able, did not intervene in the fall. These are the basic and introductory aspects of the fall of man. I am sure that questions have arisen, that areas of concern and deeper study are necessary. Be sure to contact your local family federation. Obtain a copy of the Divine Principle or study in further seminars. Thank you very much.